The word that destroyed Elvis wasn't love or dying or help. It was one simple word, loved, past tense. When the woman in the fourth row stood up during his concert and cried out, "He loved you so much," Elvis knew immediately what she meant. Her son was gone, and this mother had come to his show not to celebrate, but to grieve. What happened in the next 3 minutes would become the most emotional moment in Elvis's entire career. Because when he whispered his response back to her, he didn't just comfort a grieving mother. He showed 22,000 people what it means to be truly human. It was September 3rd, 1976, at the Mid-South Coliseum in Memphis, Tennessee. The arena was packed with 22,000 fans who had come to see the king of rock and roll perform. The atmosphere was electric, filled with the kind of anticipation that only an Elvis concert could generate. Elvis was in good spirits that night. He'd just returned from a brief vacation and seemed refreshed, energized. He'd opened the show with a powerful rendition of C.C. Rider that had the crowd on their feet, and he'd worked through his set with the confidence and charisma that had made him a legend. Now, about an hour into the show, Elvis was performing "How Great Thou Art," one of his favorite gospel songs. It was a moment in the concert where things usually got more intimate, more spiritual. The screaming would die down, and people would just listen, swept up in the power of Elvis's voice and the beauty of the hymn. But as Elvis sang, his eyes swept across the audience, and he noticed something unusual. In the fourth row, slightly to the left of center stage, a woman was standing. She wasn't swaying to the music or singing along like everyone around her. She was just standing there, completely still, staring at Elvis with an expression that made his voice falter for just a moment. The woman's name was Patricia Henderson, and she was 42 years old. 3 days earlier, she had buried her only son, Marcus Henderson, who had been just 16 years old when cancer took him. Patricia hadn't wanted to come to this concert. When her sister Joan had suggested it 2 weeks ago, Patricia had looked at her like she was insane. Her son was dying. How could she think about going to a concert? But Joan had persisted. "Patricia, you haven't left Marcus's side in 6 months. You need a break, even if it's just for a few hours. Besides, you know how much Marcus loves Elvis. When he gets better, you can tell him you saw Elvis perform. It'll give him something to look forward to." Patricia had finally agreed, mostly to get her sister to stop asking. They'd bought tickets for September 3rd. It seemed far enough in the future that surely Marcus would be better by then. Surely the new treatment would work. Surely they'd have more time. But they didn't have more time. Marcus Henderson died on August 31st, 1976, with his mother holding his hand and Elvis's voice singing "Can't Help Falling in Love" on the record player beside his hospital bed. The funeral had been on September 2nd. Patricia had been numb through the entire service, unable to cry, unable to speak, unable to process that her beautiful boy was gone. Friends and family had surrounded her, offering condolences that sounded like white noise. Nothing reached her. Nothing could penetrate the fog of grief that had settled over her like a suffocating blanket. On the morning of September 3rd, Patricia had found the concert tickets in her purse. Her first instinct was to throw them away. How could she possibly go to a concert? Her son had died 3 days ago. The idea of sitting in an arena full of happy, screaming fans felt obscene. But then she'd looked at the tickets more closely and seen the date written in Marcus's handwriting. He'd been so excited when Joan had told them about getting the tickets. Even though he'd been too sick to write much by then, he'd insisted on writing the date on the tickets himself. September 3rd, he'd written in shaky letters, "The day Mom sees Elvis." Patricia had started crying then, really crying for the first time since Marcus had died. And she'd made a decision. She would go to that concert, not because she wanted to, not because she thought it would make her feel better, but because Marcus had wanted her to go. Because in some strange way, going to that concert felt like keeping a promise to her son. Joan had been shocked when Patricia called and said she wanted to use the tickets. Patricia, are you sure? Nobody would expect you to.
I'm going, Patricia had said firmly. Marcus wanted me to see Elvis. So I'm going to see Elvis.
Now, standing in that arena, surrounded by thousands of screaming fans, Patricia felt more alone than she'd ever felt in her life. The music that was bringing everyone else joy felt like knives cutting into her heart. Every lyric reminded her of Marcus. Every note reminded her of all the times she'd heard Elvis's music playing from her son's bedroom. When Elvis began singing How Great Thou Art, something inside Patricia broke. This had been Marcus's favorite hymn. They'd played it at his funeral. The pastor had talked about how the song spoke of God's majesty and power, and how Marcus was now in God's presence. Patricia's hands began to shake. Her breathing became rapid and shallow. The grief that she'd been holding back for 3 days suddenly crashed over her like a tsunami. She stood up, not consciously deciding to, but unable to remain seated. The people around her glanced over, slightly annoyed at first that someone was blocking their view. But then they saw her face. They saw the tears streaming down her cheeks. They saw the way her whole body was trembling, and they understood that something was very wrong. Elvis was in the middle of the second verse when he noticed the woman standing in the fourth row. There was something about the way she was looking at him that made his voice catch. It wasn't the look of a fan. It was the look of someone in profound pain, someone drowning. He kept singing, but his eyes kept returning to her. The woman's mouth was moving, and even though he couldn't hear what she was saying over the music and his own voice, he could read her lips. She was saying something over and over again. He loved you. He loved you. Then suddenly the woman's voice cut through everything. She wasn't screaming exactly. It was something between a cry and a wail, raw and desperate and utterly heartbreaking. He loved you so much. The words hit Elvis like a physical blow. The past tense. Loved, not loves. Loved. He stopped singing mid-word. His hand, which had been gesturing to emphasize a lyric, froze in mid-air. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The band kept playing for a few more seconds, confused by Elvis's sudden silence, before they too began to trail off, uncertainly. 22,000 people, who had been clapping and swaying to the music, gradually fell silent as they realized something unprecedented was happening. Elvis Presley had stopped performing mid-song, and he was staring at someone in the audience with an expression of such profound sadness that it made people's breath catch. He loved you so much, Patricia cried out again, louder this time, her voice breaking on the word loved. My baby loved you so much. The arena was now completely silent, except for Patricia's crying. Even the people who couldn't see what was happening could feel it. Something important was unfolding, something sacred. Elvis set his microphone down on its stand and walked to the edge of the stage. The bright stage lights made it hard for him to see clearly into the audience, so he held up his hand to shield his eyes, trying to get a better look at the woman who had spoken. Ma'am, Elvis said, his voice carrying clearly through the arena even without the microphone because of how quiet everyone had become. Ma'am, what did you say? Patricia looked up at Elvis Presley, the man whose music had been the soundtrack to her son's short life, and the words poured out of her in a rush. My son, my Marcus, he died 3 days ago. He was 16 years old, and he loved you. He loved you so much. Your music was the last thing he heard before he died. I played Can't Help Falling in Love for him, and he smiled. Even though he was dying, he smiled because of your music. The entire arena could hear her now. People were pulling out tissues. Mothers were holding their children closer. Fathers were wiping their eyes. Elvis stood at the edge of the stage, and tears were streaming down his face. His hands were trembling. He looked like a man who had been shot and was trying to process the wound. What was his name? Elvis asked, his voice so thick with emotion that it was barely recognizable. Your son, what was his name? Marcus, Patricia said, her voice barely above a whisper now. Marcus Henderson. Elvis nodded slowly, as if committing the name to memory. Then he did something that nobody in that arena expected. He sat down. Right there on the edge of the stage, he sat down, his legs dangling over the side, putting himself at a more equal level with the woman in the fourth row. Marcus, Elvis repeated quietly, but his body microphone picked it up and carried it through the arena. That's a strong name. A good name. Patricia nodded, unable to speak anymore, her entire body shaking with sobs. Elvis was quiet for a long moment, looking down at his hands. When he looked back up at Patricia, his face was a mixture of grief, compassion, and something else. Something that looked almost like guilt. Ma'am, Elvis said, and now he picked up his microphone again so everyone could hear clearly. Ma'am, I want to tell you something, and I want everyone here to hear it too. The arena was so quiet you could hear people breathing. 22,000 people waited for what Elvis Presley was about to say. Elvis looked directly at Patricia Henderson, and when he spoke, his voice was clear and firm, even though tears were still running down his face. Your son Marcus didn't love me. He loved the music, and the music doesn't belong to me. It belongs to God. I'm just the person who gets to share it. So when your son smiled hearing Can't Help Falling in Love, that wasn't about me. That was about something bigger than me. Bigger than all of us. That was about love itself, real love, the kind of love that doesn't end just because someone's body gives out. Patricia's knees buckled slightly, and the people next to her reached out to steady her. Elvis continued, his voice growing stronger. And I want you to know something else. Marcus isn't gone. Not really. Love doesn't die. Music doesn't die. Everything good that your son was, everything beautiful about him, that's still here. It's in your heart. It's in the hearts of everyone who knew him. And now it's in my heart too. He paused, and then he leaned forward slightly, as if he was about to share a secret. You said Marcus loved me. But here's the truth, ma'am. I never met your son. I never knew him, but I already loved him. You want to know why? Patricia nodded, unable to speak. Because your son loved music, and anyone who loves music, truly loves it, understands something important about life. They understand that we're all connected, that we're all part of something bigger. Your son understood that, and that makes him wise beyond his years. Elvis wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. So thank you for bringing Marcus here with you tonight. Thank you for letting me know about him. I'm honored that my music brought him comfort. But more than that, I'm grateful that he existed, that he lived, that he loved. Then Elvis stood up, walked back to his microphone stand, and turned to his band. Boys, I need you to follow me on this one. He turned back to the audience. This next song, I'm singing for Marcus Henderson, a boy I never met but will never forget. And I'm singing it for his mama, Patricia, who loved her son enough to be here tonight, even though I know it must be breaking her heart. Elvis began singing How Great Thou Art again, but this time it was different. There was a rawness to his voice that hadn't been there before. Every word seemed to carry the weight of the conversation that had just happened. When he got to the chorus, his voice soared higher and more powerful than anyone had ever heard it. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. And something miraculous happened. The entire arena, all 22,000 people, began singing along. Not the usual singing along of a crowd at a concert, but something different, something reverent. It sounded like a church service. It sounded like a prayer. Patricia Henderson stood in the fourth row, surrounded by strangers who had become something more than strangers in that moment, and she sang too. For the first time since Marcus had died, she felt something other than grief. She felt connected. She felt loved. She felt like maybe, somehow, everything would be okay. When the song ended, the applause was different too. It wasn't the usual screaming and cheering. It was respectful, emotional, the kind of applause you hear when people have witnessed something transcendent. Elvis wiped his eyes again and addressed the crowd. I want to thank all of you for bearing with me just now. I know you came here for a show, and instead you got, he paused, searching for the right words. You got real life. You got the messy, painful, beautiful reality of what it means to be human. He looked back toward where Patricia was standing. Ma'am, I'd like you to come backstage after the show if you're willing. I have something I want to give you. Not because I think it will make anything better, but because I want Marcus to be remembered. And I want you to know that he mattered to me, even though I never met him. Patricia nodded, tears still streaming down her face, but now she was smiling too. A small smile, barely there, but real. Elvis continued with his concert, but everything had changed. Every song seemed to carry more weight. Every interaction with the audience felt more genuine, more meaningful. People who were there that night would later say it was the best concert Elvis ever gave, not because of his technical performance, but because of his humanity. After the show, Patricia Henderson was escorted backstage by security. She was nervous, unsure what to expect. Joan had come with her, holding her hand, providing silent support. Elvis was waiting in his dressing room. He'd changed out of his jumpsuit into more casual clothes, and he looked tired but peaceful. When Patricia entered, he stood up immediately. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, walking over to her. "Thank you for coming back here. Thank you for sharing Marcus with me." "Thank you," Patricia said, her voice hoarse from crying. "Thank you for what you said out there. I don't think you realize what it meant to me." Elvis shook his head. "I think I do. Losing someone you love, it's the hardest thing in the world. I lost my mama when I was 23, and there are still days when I wake up and forget for a moment that she's gone. The pain doesn't go away, but it changes. It becomes something you can carry." He walked over to a table where several items were laid out. "I want to give you something. I've been thinking about what would be right, what would honor Marcus." Elvis picked up a black and white photograph. It showed him on stage, microphone in hand, looking out at an unseen audience. He'd signed it, "For Marcus Henderson, a soul who understood the power of music. You made me remember why I do this. Rest in peace, son." Elvis Presley, September. "I want you to have this," Elvis said, handing the photo to Patricia. "But more importantly, I want you to have this." He handed her a small notebook. Patricia opened it and saw that Elvis had written several pages of text in his distinctive handwriting. "I wrote down what I said to you tonight," Elvis explained, "because I didn't want you to forget. I didn't want Marcus to be forgotten. And I wrote some other thoughts too, about music and love and why we're all here. I think Marcus understood these things, even at 16, maybe especially at 16, when everything is still pure and real and not yet complicated by adult cynicism." Patricia looked down at the notebook, at Elvis's handwriting filling the pages, and she started crying again. But this time, they weren't just tears of grief. They were tears of gratitude, of connection, of feeling seen and understood. "There's one more thing," Elvis said quietly. He pulled out a small cassette tape. "This is a recording from tonight. The whole interaction, the song I sang for Marcus, all of it. I know it might be painful to listen to now, but someday, maybe when the grief isn't quite so sharp, you might want to hear it. You might want to remember that your son's life mattered so much that 22,000 people sang for him, that the king of rock and roll stopped his show to honor him." Patricia took the tape with shaking hands. "I don't know what to say. How can I ever thank you for this?" Elvis smiled sadly. "You already did. You told me about your son. You reminded me that every person in every audience has a story, that they're not just fans or faces in a crowd. They're humans with full, complicated, beautiful lives. Marcus taught me that tonight, even though he wasn't there, that's his gift to me. Joan, who had been standing quietly by the door, spoke up. Mr. Presley, you gave my sister and her son something precious. Music was their connection. Even at the end, even when Marcus couldn't speak anymore, he could still listen, and he smiled. Elvis nodded, understanding. Music is the universal language. It crosses all boundaries, even the boundary between life and death. Marcus knew that. And now, everyone who was in that arena tonight knows it too. Patricia carefully placed the photograph and notebook in her purse, clutching the cassette tape like it was the most precious thing in the world. I should let you go. You must be exhausted. No, Elvis said quickly. I'm not tired. Tell me more about Marcus. What was he like? What made him laugh? What were his dreams? And so, for the next hour, Patricia Henderson sat in Elvis Presley's dressing room and told him about her son. She told him about how Marcus had learned to play guitar by copying Elvis's movements from videos. She told him about Marcus's dream of becoming a musician himself. She told him about the last conversation they'd had, when Marcus had told her not to be sad because he'd lived a good life, even if it was a short one. Elvis listened to every word, occasionally asking questions, laughing at the funny stories, crying at the painful ones. His manager came in twice to remind him that they needed to leave, that they had a schedule to keep. But Elvis waved him off both times. This is more important, Elvis said simply. This is what matters. When Patricia finally left that night, escorted back to her car by security, she felt different. The grief was still there, heavy and real and overwhelming. But there was something else now, too. A sense that Marcus's life had meant something, that his death wasn't just a tragic ending, but part of a larger story about love and connection and the power of music to bind people together. The story of what happened that night at the Mid-South Coliseum spread quickly. People who had been there told their friends and family. Local newspapers ran stories about Elvis stopping his concert to honor a dead fan. Within days, hundreds of letters arrived at Elvis's management office, all from people sharing their own stories of loss and how music had helped them through it. Elvis read every single letter. He personally responded to 17 of them, the ones that touched him most deeply. He started a small foundation in Marcus Henderson's name, providing music therapy for terminally ill children in hospitals. For Patricia Henderson, the items Elvis gave her that night became her most treasured possessions. She framed the photograph and hung it in Marcus's room, which she couldn't bring herself to change. She read Elvis's notebook dozens of times, finding new comfort in his words each time, and eventually, about 6 months later, she was able to listen to the cassette tape. When she did, sitting alone in her living room with the lights dim, she heard her own voice crying out to Elvis. She heard the pain in it, the desperation, but she also heard what came after. She heard Elvis's words, gentle and powerful and true. She heard 22,000 people singing "How Great Thou Art" for her son. And she heard in the background of the recording the sound of her own voice, joining in, finding strength she didn't know she had. That's when Patricia Henderson finally began to heal. Not because the grief went away, it never fully went away, but because she understood what Elvis had been trying to tell her that night. Love doesn't die. Marcus wasn't gone, not really. He lived on in her heart, in her memories, in the music that had connected them, and now in the story that would be told for decades about the night Elvis Presley stopped his show for a grieving mother. Elvis never forgot Marcus Henderson. In interviews later, when asked about the most meaningful moments of his career, he would often mention that night in Memphis. "I've played for presidents and kings," he would say, "but the most important thing I ever did was stop a show for a mother who'd lost her son. That's when I understood what my gift was for, not for fame or fortune, but for connection, for love. The 7 words Elvis whispered back to Patricia Henderson that night. The words that the microphone barely picked up, but that Patricia heard clear as a bell, were simple but profound. Marcus is singing with the angels now, but it was what he'd said publicly, what all 22,000 people heard, that really mattered. Love doesn't die. Music doesn't die. And he was right. Decades later, people still tell the story of that night. They still talk about the mother who cried out to Elvis and the response that changed everyone who heard it. Marcus Henderson, who died at 16, touched thousands of lives he never met, simply because his mother was brave enough to speak her grief aloud, and Elvis Presley was wise enough to honor it. That's the legacy of September 3rd, 1976. Not just a concert, but a moment when a superstar proved he was more than his fame, when a grieving mother found comfort in an unexpected place, and when 22,000 strangers became a community, united in their understanding that life is precious, love is eternal, and music has the power to heal even the deepest wounds.